This is a beginner-friendly acrylic painting tutorial focusing on monochromatic shades and tints. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button. First, you need a canvas or thick watercolor paper to paint on, and then I'm going to be tracing a photograph of my cat. So when I do this in the classroom, we use this graphite tracing paper, and it transfers your image by using the dark side or the graphite side pressing down onto your surface. I like to do a tracing exercise with my students because many of them do not have confidence drawing and they have very little experience painting. So if you take away the challenge of having to draw your subject matter, and then you can really focus on the technique of painting. My professor in college in our painting course shared this philosophy with me, and I brought it into my classroom as well. Drawing is a very important skill, and you certainly could freehand your image, but if you're focusing on learning to paint, being a beginner, I think it's wonderful to eliminate the drawing component, especially if you took your own photograph or found it from a copyright-free educational source. When tracing your image, try to make your mind see how you can not just outline shapes, but you're focusing on areas of light and dark. So I'm not just circling around the eyeball. Do you see how I'm also going around that light gray shape on either side? Check your work often because sometimes transfer paper betrays you. And then once you have all of your details, then it's time to start painting. With our paint here, we're going to do some shade and tint practices, and my students always complete this exercise before we start painting, but I'm gonna do it in real time. So first of all, I'm gonna make my own neutral dark. I'm gonna call it black, quote unquote. It is not Mars black. It is not inkjet printer black. It's not India ink black. It's made using the primary colors, the traditional primary colors. I know you could also say CMY is primary, sure, but I'm talking like old school traditional red, yellow, and blue. You're gonna make a violet, and then you're gonna neutralize it by adding yellow. So if it looks too brown, add a ton more blue. And if it looks too purple, add just a little bit of yellow. So to make your own dark neutral, and I have a whole video that breaks this down even slower, lots and lots of blue, pretty good amount of red, and a little tiny kiss of yellow. Then I'm gonna kind of mark where I see my darkest values. Where is it truly black? Not dark gray, but as dark as possible. And so I'm gonna kind of map those in, and I'm going to use my smallest brush and paint in those sections. The beauty of acrylic paint is you could layer over this over and over and over again, so don't be afraid to paint something one value, question it, and change it later. I'm also going to be painting very slow at first, and then you're gonna see me speed things up and also do a time lapse. I have about 2.5 hours of footage of me painting. So although this video is less than 20 minutes, it certainly didn't take me less than 20 minutes to film it. And again, going and finding those areas all over the painting that truly are that darkest black value. If it's drying and you made your own neutral dark and you think it's not jet black, you can always go over it 2 or 3 times, and sometimes you can make a better dark value later on in the painting session. So don't let that stop you. Go ahead and paint the darkest value you've created, and then you can go from there. Staying in the lines you drew is important, but I often find myself painting a little bit loosely and then tightening things up on the second pass, and then tightening things up as I add my values. If you're thinking this looks like a paint by numbers, it is. A paint by numbers you create yourself. Okay, now that we have our darkest value, let's make a dark gray. So if we're calling this black, let's make darkest gray by separating out a section of it and adding a little tiny bit of white. I'm gonna test that out on my value scale. It is a nice dark gray. It's still very dark, so I'm gonna go in and find in my photograph where are examples of a really dark gray that isn't black but really close. And again, you can layer, you can make a mistake, you can say, oh, that needs to be lighter or darker. And speaking of lighter, I'm gonna add a little bit of white to my gray and continue on. So mixing this up, this is still a dark gray, but it's just not darkest gray. So I don't have exactly an endpoint of how many values I'm gonna create. I think 7 is a really good place to start. And so I'm going to kind of manipulate this. It got a little too light at first, so I'm just gonna adjust with a clean brush by adding more of that dark. And that's why having a value scale in front of you is important, because you can really check that your values are progressively getting lighter or progressively getting darker, depending on which area you're starting with. I always like to start with the darks first because it just gives that bam of contrast. Mapping those out by looking carefully at my reference image. Now I'm going into dark gray, knowing that this is going to connect to a lot of my dark values. My image is complicated, which I think is a good thing. My cat has a beautiful fur with a pattern in it, and I made sure to pick something without a boring background. The rug that she is sitting on, this is my cat Blue, by the way, and she's so cute. Has a lot of details that I can include, but also I don't have to like nitpick every single detail because it's a rug. So it could be a little different than the photograph. So I want it to look as close as possible, but I'm giving myself permission to, you know, let it kind of go as I like. It doesn't have to be as carefully painted, in my opinion, as the cat, because I know and love my subject matter. So if you're doing a pet portrait, you're going to want to capture the essence of the animal or pet that you've chosen, and really any subject matter as well. Let's continue on to our fourth value, and now we're getting into like a dark medium gray. And looking at my reference photo, I'm figuring out where I see this dark medium gray, how I see it connecting to my photograph. So you're really going to be a student of looking at your image, looking at the gray that you created. And you can do this in any color, by the way. You could do red, you could do blue. You do not have to stick to just grayscale. I just think if you're new to painting, it's a really great exercise in seeing value. A lot of times students think that this is a color assignment, and it is because you have a base color, but the focus is value. There's areas of light and dark and how they can work to create contrast. Laying in all my values here, and it's really satisfying to start to see it come to life. Still at the darker end of things. Let's mix. This is going to be more in the middle zone. And again, I don't know what the exact middle is going to be because it just depends on how many values I make. I remember in college, we had to do a 21-step value scale. So when I have my students do like 7 values, I don't feel bad about that at all. Testing it out and seeing where this nice medium gray will go, and how satisfying that this isn't from a tube, but I created it using just red, yellow, and blue. You could definitely use the cyan, magenta, and yellow combo if you wanted, but I am more of a traditional red, yellow, and blue. That is how I have been trained to use my colors. Adding this nice gray, I feel like it captures a lot of the rug. So I'm going to speed things up and really get a lot of that gray in the background. One mistake I see young artists make is to isolate where you just work on the subject and not the background. So think of your painting as a whole and lay in all the values for each section. Try not to isolate just one part at a time, because then you won't have as much harmony. What a satisfying gray this is. And this is more mid gray. Looking at 5, how it dried, I think that 5th value is a little bit darker, so I'm going to map that in. And it looks like in my photograph, my rug gets a little bit lighter towards the right edge of the painting, so I'm trying to capture that in my work as well. And if you think I'm painting faster, I am. I sped things up twice the speed because, again, 2.5 hours of footage is just not the attention span that I have noticed my students can have in the classroom. And if you're doing this at home, you can slow things down. You can pause as needed. It's not like you're doing the same photograph, right? This is just my philosophy on how to do it. But when you paint, you're going to find tricks that work for you, and everyone paints differently. Mixing up another medium gray. I love the light end of the spectrum here. So this is more getting into the tint category. And with gray and monochromatic, you know, a shade is a base color mixed with black. A tint is a base color mixed with white. So it's like all shades, tints, and tones up in here. But I do really love those light grays. I'm finding out where they go, and I'm letting the face be a little bit darker. I know that my cat's face is very light, and so as I build up to it, I'm going to make sure that it contrasts and pops from the darker or medium gray in the background. Doing the same with my 8th value, mapping out where it is, filling in my shapes, and she really is starting to come to life. Make sure when you're doing this, again, that you're focusing on not just the subject, but the background as well. Don't neglect the background. A painting is just like writing a story. Your subject can't exist fully without a setting or a background. So make sure you're thinking about it holistically and not just isolating your subject matter. Adding a little bit more white here to get into my lighter grays. This is my 9th value, and so we are focusing now on those beautiful light grays. How satisfying is that? And I'm going to go through and find those areas of light gray. And again, you're going to see me overlap over and over again to find those values. This gray might be a little dark, but I'm going to go ahead and use it to fill in a lot of these blank spaces in the rug, and then I can kind of texture in a lighter and darker value to make that make sense. So let's speed things up here so I can fill in this nice repetitive design of the rug, getting that lighter value. Again, I think it's still a little bit too dark, but I honestly don't mind if it's a little darker than the photograph. Then I can really make my cat's face pop. So although it looks very monochromatic right here, like the grays look very similar, there's not a lot of contrast, this is laying down the groundwork, and then I can go in and lighten up again, making a 10th light value, and see if I can make those light values have some more contrast. So you can see that this is much lighter, and I'm going to go in first to the detail of the cat, using my small round brush. So I'm using very small brushes for the detail work and then a little bit of a larger brush for the larger spaces. And I'm just trying to do like a textured view here, going in with that light gray, and it's still not light enough. But again, you've heard me say this before, I'm just gonna kind of map it on there, and then I can go over and layer and really focus on my texture. So my painting at first, the first layer of everything, looks a little bit, not messy, but a little bit more broad. And then I go in and I really hyperfixate on all the details. This isn't my lightest gray yet, but it's the lightest one I've made so far. And I'm gonna find those light values, again, focusing on the face. I wanna really make sure my detail is there and that those areas pop before I work out the details of the rug. Paying close attention to her eyes, and notice I haven't done any of the detail work like the whiskers or anything like that. That's the type of thing I'm gonna go back in and add once everything's dry and I'm going in with my tiniest round brush. We have our 12th value here, a really nice light gray. So again, finding all of those light values in the face, going and overlapping, knowing that it doesn't look perfect right now, but I can go in, and I think my background in sculpting is really helpful when I'm painting. I know that I can like carve in different values. I can cut away with a lighter layer, knowing that nothing is permanent when it comes to acrylic paint. If this was India ink or watercolor, I would have a very different feeling about it. And I'm just gonna see what I can lighten and brighten using this value. Now, what if I use pure white? What would happen, and this is a wet on wet technique, if I take pure white and go back on top of those areas of light gray? Wet on wet can be a really good way to kind of blend color together, blend your value. If you're not ready for like a really stark white or a really change in value, you can kind of go in and play with that. Now I'm going to do some touch-up work where I manipulate my values point by point. So I'm not focusing so much on going from dark to light. I'm going to see what it needs and mix custom values as I go. So I want certain spots of the rug to be lighter, so I'm taking that lighter gray and finding those textured areas. Paying close attention to edges. So for example, the edge of my nose and the edge of my eye, and I'm not outlining, but I'm finding where those shapes need clear edges and they need a clear separation from the shapes that are near them. This is where I'm going to start paying attention to detail work. I'm taking this dark value again and finding those areas that maybe I lost the first time. How dark is the rug in contrast to the light edge of her face? And you can see I'm mixing values in that area, so I'm not doing like one big value at a time. I'm kind of micro changing each value, focusing on small areas of the face and small areas of the background. Blending them in, that is a wet and wet technique as well. You can also wait until it's dry, and that'll be very helpful too to get those small details. This is the part of the painting process that I call the hyperfixation phase. I mean, I could really sit here and do this until the end of time, finding those little textures, finding just the slight variety of different grays. And I think that the hardest thing about knowing when you're done with a painting is knowing when you're done. I feel like I could never be truly finished with a painting. I could sit down and fix it, work on it, come at it with new ideas. And so I'm going to try and just make sure not only do I have my whole surface covered, but how is my craftsmanship? How do each section looks compared to the other? And I'm going to speed things up here to a time lapse because I'm doing a lot of the same revisions. And now it's going to be pure white. So things are dry. I'm going to go in and find those lightest of light values. Her face has a lot of light gray, but I'm going to take some artistic license and I'm going to make the light areas pure white so they really contrast and pop from the background. Another trick, I was having a hard time with the eyes. I'm going to flip the painting. You can even paint upside down. So you're looking at it from a different vantage point. And sometimes that can help you see shapes and relationships different. A painting is all about relationships and how things work together cohesively. And so you're going to see me spend a lot of time on the face, really trying to find those areas that need just a little bit of texture and a slightly different value. I'm going to leave you here as I fixate on all of my details. It's taking everything in my power not to just zoom forward and make this a time lapse, but I think it's important to watch how each little detail comes together. And then once I feel happy with that, I'm going to add my whiskers. See you in a minute. Now that I've done so much detail work, I think it's time to add my whiskers. And I'm going to use my smallest round brush, and I'm not going to paint a straight solid white line. I'm going to kind of lift my brush in certain areas to give it that thin, translucent look. So I'm not trying to do like a really thick whisker. I'm okay with some of it kind of like disappearing into the background. I want it very visible, but it doesn't need to be like a perfectly same thickness line. Sometimes my students use a shish kebab stick for this step, but I like to use just my smallest round brush and just kind of like pull and lift my brush up and then go back and add a little bit of a darker, well, lighter because I'm using pure white, a little bit of a more solid area to really get that across. Then I go in and kind of carve in some of those darks again, make sure I'm happy with everything. And if you're tired of a painting, a good thing to do is hide it from your site for a few days and come back to it. My students don't always have that luxury, but luckily this assignment this year fell where they had spring break and then they're going to come back to it with fresh eyes. So here is my adorable grayscale cat blue using, what did I get to, 13 different values on my value scale. And this is the finished look. It's such a great practice of painting with acrylic paint, taking color out of the equation and just focusing on value. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more tutorials, check these out. All of my resources, lesson plans, and student examples are free on my website, thatartteacher.com.